Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Airspeed's Korra Rewatch video. This one is going to be for episode 2 of book 1 Air, A Leaf in the Wind. And yeah, second episode, obviously it's our kind of second introductory episode. Obviously they kind of aired very close together. And it's another, I think, really good episode towards the start of the season. This is where we obviously get introduced to Mako and Bolin, the idea of pro bending, and then where is Korra with regards to airbending. And in that sense, it tackles a lot of interesting topics here, and I think it tackles them really, really well, because the pro bending links into the airbending very, very nicely with the idea that pro bending represents like the most modern form of bending. And Tenzin obviously just sees it as a sport that doesn't really have any impact on actual bending. Whereas Korra, of course, is interested in, having only heard about it and maybe heard little bits and pieces of it in the Water Tribe. And now here she is, just as she says, a ferry ride away from actually going to these events. And here she is kind of thrust into it. And it turns out to be this surprisingly amazing teaching tool for her, and that it was exactly what she needed to, I suppose, a way to demonstrate the skills of airbending in a more kind of action-centric situation than the just, here's some spinning gates, here's a kind of concept, learn it through these gates. And you see that Korra kind of more adapts to learning things when it is more clear cut, in that obviously later on she learns the benefit of meditation and stuff like that, but right now she doesn't really see it. She can't really grasp the idea that the Bagua, circle walking through the gates is about, the core idea of airbending, which is that it's about kind of dodging, it's kind of more defense focused, constantly staying moving, and the benefit of that. Whereas it's a technique that perfectly suits pro bending, being able to dodge those attacks, quick attacks, very, very effortlessly. Whereas that's something she hasn't learned in her fire, earth, and water bending training. In that, it's an interesting thing to think about, in that up close, you'd have to say that like airbending is probably right up there in terms of when you're really, really close to someone. Airbending is one of the better kind of bending forms up close, because we saw when like Aang and Zuko fought, Aang being able to dodge and move like he does, he's able to kind of stay really close to Zuko, and when like Zuko got very aggressive, Aang could just like move behind him and just constantly, have his hand basically on his back and move with Zuko, so Zuko could never hit him. And it's that same idea here, that airbending is the most traditional form of bending, because obviously, because of the whole air nomad genocide, they don't have that many airbenders in the world, and so to keep airbending alive, Tenzin has to keep the traditions of it alive, and so it hasn't had its chance to become more modern. But Korra is seeing here that the most traditional style at this point works very well in the most modern style of bending, and it gives her this advantage because she's learning, I suppose, this new fighting style from Mako and Bolin, and I suppose how to use her general airbending skills in the arena, and it's kind of very much helping her to have this kind of blend of learning the tradition but also learning the modern stuff. And in that way, this is a very good thematic episode for a lot of the things that are explored across Korra, which is that it is kind of us learning about how modern things are, but also that tradition is still like an important thing, that airbending is still powerful. The other elements and the characters who more represent traditional bending are still exceptionally powerful within the framework of the entire series. So I've always been a fan of pro bending, and watching it here, I still enjoy it. I get why maybe people feel like it's a little bit too focused on in this season, but I'm okay with it because they kind of drop it after this season. There's like a couple of scenes in book 2, and then we don't really see it again for the rest of the show. Whereas I'd like it to come back. I'd like to get some sort of a reference to like, okay, who are the big pro bending teams currently in the universe? Who won the last couple of tournaments? Will Korra, Mako, Bolin like ever go back to doing any pro bending? Because I'd like to see that happen. But I think it adds a nice layer, and it's a good world building thing as well, because it makes sense that in a very modern city where the idea of like we're in a period of time where sports are a thing that can happen, and it makes sense that with bending, why not have a sport related to bending? Because that's what every sport is. It's about skills, talents that humans have, and then creating a kind of competitive environment around certain skills. Bending is a skill that is unique to the Avatar world. Why not? And it adds, I suppose, to what they're trying to go for here in the season of like bender, non-bender inequality. And here is a sport that only benders can do. And it seems to be established as being the most popular sport, if not one of the only sports. And that gives, obviously, an advantage to some benders in that people could become competitors in this and make money. But the other angle on it is that, for the most part, the way it comes across is that it's a sport that is liked by non-benders as well. And I like how later on it will be brought up, I think by Mako and Bolin primarily, and Korra, that this is actually a thing that, yes, it's benders fighting, but it brings everyone together because it's something that they enjoy. And Amon, I suppose, more tries to make it out as this thing that represents the worst of the city, that it is too focused on bender, non-bender, against non-benders. And, we see little bits and pieces of this across the season, in that there's definitely a need for some sort of a change to happen, but that it is not as extreme as the Equalists are kind of making it out to be, in that, pro bending is fine, it's not that big of a problem. The problem perhaps would be that, for the most part, the people in power are primarily the benders, and then the main opposition of the Equalist would be the Triad, as like very much the benders who are actually oppressing non-benders. And that's I think an important distinction to make. But pro bending itself, while I agree it's a different style of fighting, and it's ultimately, I don't think, as interesting as just seeing a kind of standard bending fight. But I appreciate what you can do with a sport when you establish certain rules and put limits on things, because you learn over the course of this episode some of the rules of pro bending, that you have to push a team back, then you can advance forward, and then you can instantly win the game by knocking all three opponents out in a specific round. But then you learn things like you can't move forward without having made the progress by pushing the opposing team back. You can't push people over the sides with bending, you can only really push them back. And they start to get a little bit more clever with it as we go forward, as we learn more of the rules, with stuff like, okay, there are limitations, of course, because we know bending can get insanely powerful, so earthbenders are limited to the discs on the ground. There's only those kind of pools of water kind of in between the sections of the arena. And then you can only continuously like fire water at someone for a certain amount of time. You're not, with most of the elements, you're not allowed to aim for the head, and stuff like that. And it creates an interesting, I suppose, sporting environment of just, what can you do? How clever can you actually be? And you start to see some of that stuff, come into play. And it allows you to see, I suppose, different skills in bending. You really see how acrobatics and agility are a very important kind of dynamic here, as well as the ability to, I think, directly block and dodge quick attacks like that being an important skill to have, because one of the main enemies this season are going to be the Equalists, who fight in a very quick way, and they take advantage of benders primarily going for power moves by kind of sneaking past them and chi blocking. So Korra's kind of learning skills that she's going to need to use to fight the Equalists in terms of being more quick and fast paced when she fights, and it ends up working out quite well. And in a way, outside of this episode, yes, there's episode 5 where we get a lot of pro bending stuff, But that's, for the most part, that's most of it. Like 5 and 6 kind of end up being the key focuses, and even then, the fight later on is more about the cheating, and then episode 5 is more about the kind of character dynamics going on, rather than really kind of focusing on the individual bending fights as pro bending matches as being like the action set pieces. So I've never really had too much of a problem with pro bending. I don't think it's like overused or like it wastes time, because you can see here the benefit that it has, because it links into this episode very well. And it gives Korra like something to do, in terms of like, she's not just there in the city and she's training the entire time. Because then it's just a change of location, but it's still just Korra like locked in a certain position, place, doing what she wants to do. So the idea that she's being more free and actually participating in something, like now she's part of a sports team, like that wouldn't have happened. That's something that we couldn't have expected Korra to do after like the first episode, but here she is by the end of the second episode, and she's on her way to like a big sporting event. And that's a cool thing, that they established that here's kind of like a hobby for the character that's also a benefit to her in her actual training, in that she's going to learn modern fighting doing this. It's still, I suppose, physical and kind of combat training, and it seems to be helping her to kind of make up for the kind of downsides, or at least that she sees the downsides of the airbending training. And I suppose getting into the airbending training, the other side of things, they I suppose expand on the stuff from Bitter Work of like, oh, Aang struggled with earthbending because it was the opposite of airbending, but here Tenzin more clarifies for it that it's more personality focused. So with Aang, the struggle for him was earthbending, because he represented a kind of quintessential airbender, that his personality represents most of what you'd expect of an airbender. His philosophy is airbending philosophy, whereas Korra, she is more of a she is kind of more of a firebender type character in a way, or earthbender as well. You could say that she's kind of more aggressive when she fights, and so that aspect of her personality contradicts in a way with the philosophy needed to master airbending, in that with Aang and earthbending, the idea was that you have to be rooted, you have to stand up, and it countered Aang's philosophy of tending to run away from his problems, and with airbending you tend to dodge and weave around things. And here the idea is that Korra's has like this firecracker personality, where she always wants to be right there in the center of the action, yet here's an element for her that she has to more be peaceful, calm, flowing, and learning how to have a character like her personality adapt to a much more traditional, more spiritual kind of element. You could see the flaws of her character kind of come into play here, in that this is why she's not spiritual, because she's not patient enough to kind of embrace, I suppose, her spiritualness. And that's why her learning her airbending is not just the final combat element that she needs, but also it's the core, I suppose, philosophy that is needed to get on the track to becoming more spiritual. So I think that works very nicely over the course of the episode, and that they show the traditional teaching techniques not working. And they obviously come back to this in book 3 with when we get more airbenders, and Tenzin's kind of teaching methods, and how he just expects everyone to jump for joy because they're now airbenders, when in fact it's airbending culture and the way they do the training, it's different. It's kind of odd compared to what you'd expect. So it's a bit of getting used to, and it doesn't suit Korra to do stuff like this. And so meditation doesn't really work. The gates is, I suppose, as I said earlier on, perhaps a little bit too conceptual for her, and not as much like, she'd probably be more like, okay, you fire some wind at me and I'll circle dodge around it, rather than like, I'll learn how to dodge attacks by weaving through a series of gates. Like, I think we as the audience and like other characters get it, but Korra can't perhaps see the practicality of kind of what she's trying to learn here. So the episode overall built to obviously the big moment in the pro bending match, the final round, where she's on the edge and the music, the airbending music hits, and she starts to dodge. The opposing team gets tired, and the firefighters make their comeback. It's an amazing sequence because you could sort of see it coming in that her desperate dodges where she's leaning on the edge are kind of like not as kind of, I suppose, graceful versions of the kind of circle walking. And then she moves into it because I suppose what they get across over the course of this book is that we don't focus a lot on Korra's airbending training specifically. We just kind of take for granted that like it happens in the background. In the same way that Aang with basically all of his elements, there was only ever one or two scenes where we really focused on Aang learning an element. And once he got the core of like, okay, this is the basics, we just assumed like, okay, he's doing training in the background, and characters at times would mention like, oh, let's go for a training session, but we would never see it. And the idea here is that Korra, even though we don't see a lot of it, is doing training, has done all the forms and the techniques. It's just she hasn't made the breakthrough to actually doing it yet. So that's why it makes sense that she's able to do the circle walking in the correct form. It's just she hadn't been able to get to a situation where like, oh, this is where I use it. So in that sense, the overall episode with like pro bending versus traditional airbending, and I suppose that representing as well Korra versus Tenzin in this episode and their kind of argument here was really good because it showed that Tenzin can be wrong and that Korra is obviously not going to be the most easiest character to deal with throughout this season, but that Tenzin is going to have to learn a lot as well here, that he's getting frustrated with Korra, and you can see that when he talks to his family and Pema, and he's going to have to learn that, okay, she's going to need a little bit of a different kind of way to kind of push her to get to where she needs to be. And this episode, I think, was a good example of that, in that she snuck off on her own and found this kind of way to learn what she needed to learn. And it was something where Tenzin had dismissed it outright, just, I don't care about pro bending. But he himself, you could tell at the end, learned to gain an appreciation for pro bending. And while he's not the happiest that Korra is going to be distracted perhaps as being on a sports team, it's still, he sees the benefit that him giving her this bit of freedom is going to allow him to get through to her a lot better, that he's being a little bit more reasonable. But at the same time, I really like at the end where they both realized that they were at fault. And this is what I talked about in the first review of like the relationship between Korra and Tenzin is very equal. That it's master and student, but it is more equal in that Tenzin is becoming aware that he's going to learn a lot by dealing with Korra, and then we're eventually going to get to the point where they are more equals, and he will just directly learn from Korra or other characters around him, which is very good. The Air Kids were used a little bit in this episode. Jinora as the kind of oldest, demonstrating the techniques. Milo so is doing a little bit of a crazy thing. Just continuing their characterization from the first episode. Iki's a bit of a chatterbox, Milo's crazy, and then Jinora is more of the perfect student, kind of bookworm in a way. So that's that. Mako and Bolin, I suppose, the introductions, the Korra meeting the soon-to-be, I suppose, members of Team Avatar. Really cool setup here. Obviously, they're brothers. Cool that they're from, they have this kind of dual bending kind of family of Mako's a firebender, Bolin's an earthbender. And obviously we wondered, like, oh, what's the situation there? But they represent, I suppose, a more modern family coming from Republic City of, like, here is a firebender or a person from the Earth Kingdom and a person from the Fire Nation coming together. And this is how those type of kind of families work, in that I think prior to the show coming out, we knew that Aang and Katara had an airbender, a waterbender, and a non-bender. So it was mainly these two families that we kind of learned a little bit more about kind of genetics and how that sort of stuff works, how bending is passed on, that like, okay, so it's more of a situation of just whatever the parents have, there's the possibility for the children to have. And it's just a cool dynamic that the brothers aren't, they're brothers, but they don't have the same elements. So they have different personalities, but they also have different fighting styles and approaches. And I think they're both very, very interesting characters. Mako, back early on, when they kind of, the writers haven't, when the writers were treating Mako, I think, well as a character in these earlier episodes, you can see that there's a lot of hope for the character, that they're setting him up as, like, obviously Korra's main kind of romance interest. You could see he's the captain of the Fire Ferrets. They present him as being very, very skilled. That there's a reason he's the captain of the team. And then Bolin is more of the more kind of friendly of the brothers, in that Mako comes across a little bit standoffish, but Bolin has the kind of charisma of the team in a way, and the mascot, the Fire Ferret stuff with Pabu comes from him. He seems to have a lot of the kind of hardcore, fangirls with him, and just from their interactions with Korra, you see that, in that, Bolin immediately thinks that, oh, is Korra another fangirl? And you see the humor of him come out as Mako immediately, the second she starts to mention she can do multiple bending elements, he gets the idea of, okay, she's the Avatar, but Bolin is kind of like, wait, are you messing with me, or what's going on here? He doesn't immediately go to Avatar when she says that, and I thought it was a fun moment to just have like, oh cool, here's Korra like sneakily revealing that she's the Avatar to someone and kind of having some fun with it. That was I think really nicely done. And then of course Bolin's the one to kind of introduce her to the idea of like, very opposite to actual earthbending, of like, no, that's good power, but in a match you'd get wrecked because you're standing so still. Try to do that exact same thing, but stay more moving. And especially for earthbending, that's a very different kind of style to that Bolin is teaching her. So it's definitely I think a good thing to have, and that I think they managed to balance it out quite well come the end of the series, that Korra is a really, really amazing traditional bender. She can do the power moves, but she can also be really acrobatic up close and do the more pro bending style stuff. And so there's that nice kind of blend, and similarly I think Mako has that as well. And then Bolin obviously gains power over the course of the series. So while I would ultimately say that yes, the bending in Korra feels a little weaker, I don't think it's like the massive problem that I think some other people have with it. Any final points here? I suppose just the fact that this is the setup for the first romance here. It's definitely Mako and Korra. The scene of them kind of staring across the bay at each other, clearly suggesting that romance and kind of saying, ship this. And it feels so weird looking at this now, given where the series eventually goes. I think it definitely speaks to the nature of how the show was produced, in that it was initially only confirmed for one season. Then the second season was confirmed, and then fairly quickly after that, 3 and 4 were confirmed. So it feels definitely like you get the impression season 1 feels a little bit separate than the other 3. Season 2 definitely feels a little different than 3 and 4, but it still feels like once they were confirmed for the last 3 seasons, they had a bit more of a kind of a continuous arc with them. With this one, it's very different in a way, and I think the Mako romance is definitely an example of that, of just how, yeah, they I think in reflection they made a mistake with what they did with focusing on the romance in the way they did. Obviously I'll talk about it in more episodes when it's more directly brought up, but you'll start to see some, I suppose, the issues come into play as we get into some of this stuff. Yeah, as for this episode, as I said, really, really, really well done. I think, as I said, with Pro Bending, I feel they actually managed to incorporate it quite well into other stuff, in that they never have an episode that is like just about pro bending. It's always pro bending But here's this other angle that pro bending kind of links into. So in this episode, it's pro bending versus traditional airbending. In episode 5, it's like, how do the team dynamics of potential romances starting between the teams, feuds, issues, how does that affect their performance in the arena? And we're dealing with both like personal drama stuff as well as pro bending arena stuff. Episode 6, of course, we have the cheating kind of dynamic with the wolf bats, but then also Amon's big attack. And then after that, pro bending isn't really a thing in the season. So I think the benefit of like them using pro bending with other stuff means that it's not as big of a problem as of it just focusing on stuff that's not important, because I think they managed to make the pro bending arena and just pro bending in general an important factor of this book, because it represents this kind of central location of the city of like everyone comes together for pro bending, and Amon attacking that arena, that central point that everyone goes to watch pro bending, is a representation of him making a big move to actually counter benders in the city. But yeah, that has been the review for episode 2 of Legend of Korra: A Leaf in the Wind. I may be able to get the review for episode 3 out over the weekend, but we'll see about that. Either way, episode 3 and 4 will be coming up in the next week or so. But yeah, in the comments let me know what your thoughts were on this episode as well as what I have to say about it. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.